The cold morning air pressed against Klaus Richter's face like a damp cloth, carrying with it the eternal smell of the sea mixed with wet concrete and the lingering odour of diesel fuel from the generators that powered the observation post. He had been awake for nearly 2 hours already, standing in the pre-dawn darkness, watching the invisible horizon where the English Channel met the sky in an indistinguishable grey blur. At 32 years old, he had seen enough of this war to know the difference between the routine anxiety of garrison duty and the genuine premonition of catastrophe. And on this particular morning in early June, something felt different in a way he could not articulate even to himself. The observation bunker where he stood was one of the newer constructions along this stretch of the Normandy coast, built into the chalky bluff overlooking what would soon become infamous as Omaha Beach, though of course he did not know that name yet. The bunker itself was a testament to German engineering, thick reinforced concrete walls that could withstand anything short of a direct hit from a battleship's main guns, with narrow observation slits that gave a commanding view of the coastline for miles in either direction. Inside, the air was stale and smelled of mildew and unwashed men, the result of too many bodies spending too many hours in an enclosed space that had inadequate ventilation despite its technical sophistication. Richter had requested better air circulation systems months ago, but like so many of his requests, it had disappeared into the bureaucratic maze of the Wehrmacht's supply system and never been heard from again. He raised the heavy Zeiss binoculars to his eyes for what must have been the 100th time that morning, scanning the horizon with the methodical precision of a man who had done this exact same thing every morning for the past 8 months. The binoculars were excellent, probably the best piece of equipment his entire battery possessed, worth more than a month of his salary, with optics so clear that on a good day he could make out individual seabirds riding the swells 5 kilometres offshore. This morning, however, the visibility was poor, a combination of the residual mist from the storm that had blown through the previous day and the natural haze that seemed to perpetually hang over the channel during the early morning hours before the sun burned it away. Behind him in the bunker, he could hear the quiet sounds of his men beginning to stir, the muted conversations conducted in whispers so as not to disturb those still sleeping, the rattle of mess kits being prepared for the morning meal, the eternal scraping sound of someone trying to get a decent flame from a temperamental lighter. His battery consisted of 4 heavy artillery pieces, massive guns that required a crew of 8 men each to operate at full efficiency, plus the support personnel, the observers, the communications specialists, the mechanics who kept the mechanical fire control systems operational. In total, he commanded just over 60 men, a mixed group that reflected the reality of the German army in the West in the spring of 1944. There were the veterans like himself, men who had survived the meat grinder of the Eastern Front and been rotated west for what was supposed to be a quieter posting, a chance to recover from the trauma of fighting the Soviets in conditions that had tested the limits of human endurance. These men were professionals, skilled at their craft, but they carried with them a bone-deep weariness that no amount of rest seemed to cure. Then there were the older reservists, men in their late 30s and 40s who had fought in the previous war and been recalled to service, solid enough soldiers but lacking the physical stamina of younger men. And finally, there were the boys, teenagers really, some as young as 17, fresh from training camps where they had been filled with propaganda about the invincibility of the Reich and the certainty of final victory, naive in a way that would have been charming if it were not so tragic given what Richter suspected was coming. He had done his best to prepare them, drilling them relentlessly on their firing procedures, making them practice their responses to every conceivable scenario until they could execute the basic tasks in their sleep. But he knew, in the way that experienced soldiers always know, that all the drilling in the world could not truly prepare men for the reality of combat, especially the kind of industrial-scale violence that characterized this war. You could teach men how to load a gun and calculate a firing solution and adjust for wind and elevation, but you could not teach them how to function when the world around them was exploding and their friends were dying and every instinct in their body was screaming at them to run. The Eastern Front had taught him that lesson thoroughly. He had learned it in the frozen hell outside Stalingrad, where he had watched an entire army die slowly of hunger and cold and Soviet artillery, ground down not by brilliant tactics, but by sheer relentless pressure applied without mercy or pause. He had learned it again during the retreat from the Caucasus, fighting desperate rearguard actions against an enemy that seemed to have infinite reserves of men and material, always one more division to throw into the line when the previous one had been destroyed. The experience had left him with a profound understanding of what industrial warfare really meant, the way that production capacity and logistics could matter more than courage or training or tactical brilliance. That understanding was why he felt such unease on this particular morning. The Atlantic Wall, which was supposed to make the coast of Europe impregnable, was in his professional opinion more of a propaganda exercise than a genuine military obstacle. Yes, there were impressive fortifications in some places, massive concrete bunkers housing heavy guns, elaborate networks of trenches and obstacles, fields sown thick with mines. But there were also huge gaps in the defences, sections where the fortifications existed only on paper, places where a determined attacker could break through with relative ease if they picked the right spot and had enough force to exploit the breakthrough. The High Command seemed to believe that the main invasion would come at Pas-de-Calais, the narrowest point of the Channel, where the distance from England to France was barely 30 kilometres. It was the logical choice, the obvious choice, and therefore that was where the bulk of the German forces in the West were concentrated, sitting and waiting for an attack that would allow them to fight the kind of set-piece battle that German doctrine preferred. Normandy was considered a secondary concern, a place that might see a diversionary attack but nothing serious, nothing that could not be handled by the forces already in place. Richter was not privy to the intelligence reports that supported this assessment, but he had his doubts. The Allies had proven themselves to be clever and resourceful, capable of deception on a grand scale. The invasion of Sicily the previous year had been preceded by an elaborate ruse that had convinced the Germans the attack would come elsewhere. Why would they not try something similar again? And even if the main attack did come at Pas-de-Calais, what was to stop them from launching a major secondary attack elsewhere, forcing the Germans to divide their forces and fight on multiple fronts simultaneously? These thoughts had occupied his mind during the long, boring months of waiting, the endless cycle of watches and drills and maintenance that constituted garrison life. He had shared some of his concerns with his commanding officer, but the major had merely shrugged and told him to follow orders and stop worrying about strategic questions that were above his pay grade. So Richter had done his job, prepared his men as best he could, and tried not to think too much about what would happen if his worst fears proved correct. The storm that had blown in on the 5th of June had been fierce, bringing high winds and heavy seas that made any kind of amphibious operation seem impossible. The German Meteorological Service had confidently predicted that the bad weather would continue for several more days, perhaps a week, giving them time to relax and lower their guard slightly. Many senior officers had taken advantage of the predicted lull to attend to personal business, and Rommel himself, the Desert Fox, the man who was supposed to be organising the defence of France, had gone back to Germany to celebrate his wife's birthday, confident that nothing would happen while he was away. Richter had found this disturbing. Yes, the weather was bad, but it was improving, and the Allies had shown a willingness to take risks that German commanders would never consider. What if they decided that the weather was good enough, that the advantage of surprise was worth the additional risk of launching an invasion in marginal conditions? But again, he was just an Oberleutnant commanding an artillery battery, and his opinion on such matters carried no weight with anyone who mattered. So here he stood, on the morning of the 6th of June, scanning the horizon through his binoculars, while behind him his men prepared for another routine day of waiting. The mist was beginning to thin slightly as the sun rose somewhere behind the overcast sky, and visibility was improving incrementally, allowing him to see perhaps a kilometre further than he had been able to see 15 minutes earlier. He swept the binoculars slowly from left to right, covering his assigned sector of observation with the methodical thoroughness that had become second nature after months of repetition. and that was when he saw it. Just a hint at first, a smudge on the horizon that might have been a cloud bank or a trick of the light or a flaw in the optics of his binoculars. He blinked, adjusted the focus slightly, and looked again. The smudge was still there, and it seemed to be getting darker, more defined, spreading across a wider section of the horizon than any natural phenomenon should occupy. His heartbeat, which had been slow and steady with the rhythm of a man half asleep on his feet, suddenly accelerated, pounding in his chest with a force that made him aware of every pulse. He twisted the focus knob with fingers that had begun to tremble slightly, bringing the image into sharper resolution, and felt the bottom drop out of his stomach as his brain finally processed what his eyes were seeing. Ships. Not one ship, not a patrol of a few ships, but ships beyond counting, a mass of dark shapes that seemed to cover the entire visible horizon from one end to the other. He swept the binoculars left, and there were more ships. He swept them right, and there were still more ships. Everywhere he looked, the sea had transformed from an empty grey expanse into a solid mass of steel and iron, a fleet so vast that it seemed to defy the laws of nature. For several seconds, perhaps as long as half a minute, Richter simply stood there frozen, unable to move or speak or think, his mind refusing to accept the evidence of his eyes because the scale of what he was seeing was too enormous to be real. This could not be happening. Fleets of this size did not exist. No nation on Earth possessed the resources to assemble this many ships in one place. It had to be a hallucination, a trick of the morning mist, something his tired brain had conjured from the anxiety of too many sleepless nights. But the image did not waver or disappear. As the light continued to improve and the mist continued to thin, the fleet only became more distinct, more obviously real, more impossibly vast. He could begin to make out individual types of vessels now, his training allowing him to identify the major classifications even at this distance. Those massive silhouettes on the horizon were battleships, the largest warships afloat, mounting guns that could hurl shells weighing as much as a small car over distances of 20 kilometers or more. Grouped around them were cruisers, smaller but still formidable, and swarms of destroyers, sleek and dangerous, moving through the formation like sheepdogs herding a flock. But it was the smaller craft that truly drove home the enormity of what he was witnessing. Landing ships of every description, ranging from large LSTS capable of carrying dozens of tanks down to small assault craft designed to put a squad of infantry on the beach, all of them packed so tightly together that in some places there seemed to be barely enough room between vessels for the water to show through. He tried to estimate numbers, his artillery training having given him a good sense of how to judge the size of formations at a distance, but after reaching several hundred, he gave up. There were too many. The mind simply could not hold a count that large. His hands, still gripping the binoculars with white-knuckled intensity, had begun to shake noticeably. He forced himself to take a deep breath, then another, trying to calm the surge of adrenaline that was flooding his system and making it difficult to think clearly. He needed to report this. The chain of command needed to know. But even as that thought formed, another part of his mind was already wondering if anyone would believe him. How could he possibly describe what he was seeing in a way that would convey the reality of it? How could mere words capture the sight of an entire ocean transformed into a carpet of warships? He lowered the binoculars and turned toward the communication station at the back of the bunker, where a sleepy-looking corporal was monitoring the field telephone that connected them to regimental headquarters. The young man looked up as Richter approached, his expression shifting from boredom to concern as he saw whatever was showing on his commander's face. Richter grabbed the handset from its cradle and cranked the handle to signal the exchange, his mind racing as he tried to formulate his report into something coherent. The connection went through after a few seconds, and a tired voice on the other end identified himself as the duty officer at regimental headquarters. Richter took another deep breath and began to speak, trying to keep his voice steady and professional despite the tremor he could hear in it. He identified himself and his position, then delivered the news as simply and directly as he could manage. There were ships in the channel, Many ships, the invasion fleet. It was here. Now. The response was exactly what he had feared. The duty officer's voice took on a tone of polite skepticism, the tone of a man humouring someone he suspected of exaggerating or panicking over nothing. There had been reports of some naval activity, yes, and there were paratroopers landing inland, but the sea conditions were still too rough for a major amphibious operation. The meteorological reports were quite clear on that point. Perhaps what Richter was seeing was a coastal patrol or a convoy that had strayed off course. He should continue to observe and report any developments, but there was no need for alarm. Richter felt a surge of frustration so intense it almost choked him. No need for alarm. The man on the other end of the phone was sitting in a comfortable headquarters building somewhere inland, looking at weather reports and intelligence summaries and coloured pins on a map, and he was telling someone who was actually looking at the invasion fleet with his own eyes that there was no need for alarm. He wanted to scream, to reach through the phone line and grab the duty officer by the throat and drag him up to this observation post and force him to look at what was coming. But that would accomplish nothing except get him arrested for insubordination. Instead, he tried again, speaking slowly and clearly, emphasizing each word. He explained that he was not talking about a few ships or a coastal patrol. He was talking about thousands of vessels, from horizon to horizon, the largest fleet anyone had ever assembled in the history of warfare. This was not a raid or a feint. This was the invasion, the main event, everything they had been preparing for and dreading for the past 2 years. The Atlantic Wall was about to be tested, and from what he could see, it was going to fail that test catastrophically. There was a longer pause this time, and when the duty officer spoke again, his tone had shifted slightly, some of the certainty replaced by uncertainty. He promised to pass the report up the chain of command and suggested that Richter should try to get a more accurate count of the vessels and their types. Then the connection was broken, leaving Richter holding a dead phone and wondering if anyone in the entire German command structure understood what was happening. He slammed the handset back into its cradle with enough force to make the corporal manning the communications station flinch, then turned and strode back to the observation slit. By now, his activity had attracted the attention of his men, and several of them had gathered near the front of the bunker, trying to see what had agitated their commander. Richter did not say anything, merely stepped aside and gestured toward the observation slit, inviting them to look for themselves. The first man to peer out was a sergeant named Müller, a veteran from the east who had fought at Kursk and survived the retreat from Ukraine, a solid professional who did not rattle easily. Müller raised his own binoculars, took one look at the horizon, and went absolutely still for several long seconds. Then he lowered the binoculars slowly, turned to look at Richter with an expression of stunned disbelief, and said in a voice barely above a whisper that they were all going to die. It was a sentiment that Richter could not argue with, but he pushed it aside and focused on the immediate necessities. His battery needed to be brought to full alert and prepared for action. The guns needed to be manned and ready to fire at a moment's notice. He began issuing orders in a rapid stream, his voice cutting through the growing babble of frightened conversation as more and more of his men crowded forward to catch a glimpse of the approaching fleet. The sergeants took up the orders and began organizing the chaos, getting men to their posts, checking that ammunition was properly stored and ready for use, ensuring that all the systems were functional. Richter returned to the observation slit and resumed his study of the fleet, trying to make sense of the formation and identify priorities for targeting. The battleships were the obvious first choice, but they were also the furthest away and the hardest to hit, and his guns, while powerful, did not have the range to engage targets at that distance. The destroyers were closer, but moving constantly, making them difficult targets. The landing craft were numerous and vulnerable, but there were so many of them that destroying a few would make no meaningful difference to the overall operation. As he watched, the fleet began to execute some kind of coordinated maneuver, the larger ships moving into what he recognized as a bombardment formation, while the landing craft began to form up into organized waves. The precision of it was remarkable, thousands of vessels all moving in concert, all responding to some central coordination that allowed them to function as a single integrated system rather than a chaotic mob. It spoke to a level of training and organization that impressed even as it terrified him. He tried to imagine what it must be like on the other side, on those ships, and found it difficult. Were the Allied soldiers as frightened as his own men? Were they having the same thoughts about the futility of what they were about to attempt? Or did they have confidence in their massive numerical advantage, secure in the knowledge that they represented an industrial power so vast that defeat was simply not a realistic possibility? He suspected the latter, and that suspicion brought with it a wave of bitter resentment. This was not how wars were supposed to be fought. Wars were supposed to be contests of skill and courage and tactical brilliance, where the better soldiers and the better commanders could overcome numerical disadvantages through superior training and morale. But this was not that kind of war. This was something new and terrible, a kind of warfare where victory went to whichever side could produce more tanks and planes and ships, where battles were won in factories thousands of kilometers from the front lines by workers who would never see combat. Germany had tried to compete on those terms and had discovered that it could not. The numbers were simply too stark, too overwhelming. American industrial output alone exceeded that of Germany, Japan, and Italy combined, and that was before you added in British and Soviet production. The Allies could afford to waste resources on a scale that would bankrupt any Axis power. They could afford to lose ships and planes and tanks because they could replace them faster than they could be destroyed. Germany could not. Every panzer knocked out was a loss that took weeks or months to replace. Every fighter shot down was one less aircraft to defend the Reich. Richter had seen the production reports that circulated among officers, documents that were supposed to be encouraging but actually told a story of industrial inadequacy. In the entire year of 1943, Germany had produced approximately 6,000 tanks of all types. The Americans, in that same year, had produced nearly 30,000, and they were increasing that output in 44. The disparity in aircraft production was even worse. Germany was building perhaps 1,000 fighters per month at its peak. The Americans and British together were building several times that number, and they were doing it while also maintaining massive bomber fleets that Germany could not match. The little man in Berlin with the ridiculous moustache, the former corporal who now styled himself as the supreme leader of the German people, had promised that willpower and racial superiority would overcome these material disadvantages. He had promised that the Aryan spirit would triumph over the mongrel democracies of the West and the Slavic hordes of the East. But willpower could not stop a bomb. Racial superiority did not make artillery shells miss their targets. Ideology was worthless when the enemy could simply drown you in steel and explosives. These were dangerous thoughts, the kind that could get a man arrested by the Gestapo if he voiced them aloud, but Richter could not help thinking them as he watched the approaching armada. This invasion was not a battle, it was a demonstration. It was the Allies showing Germany exactly what it meant to fight an industrial superpower, to go to war against nations that could convert their entire peacetime economies into war machines without even straining themselves. The United States had not rationed food to anywhere near the degree that Germany had. American civilians were living better during the war than most Germans had lived before it, and yet they were producing this impossible fleet, this armada that looked like something from a fantasy. The sun was fully up now, though still hidden behind the overcast sky, and the visibility had improved to the point where Richter could see individual sailors moving on the decks of some of the closer ships. He could see the wake patterns of the destroyers as they maneuvered into position. He could see, far in the distance, the first flights of aircraft beginning to appear, swarms of fighters and bombers that would provide air cover for the invasion and subject his positions to attack from above as well as from the sea. Where was the Luftwaffe? Where were the fighter wings that were supposed to contest Allied air superiority and prevent exactly this kind of massed aerial assault? The answer, of course, was that they barely existed anymore. Years of attrition had ground down the German Air Force to a shadow of its former self. What planes remained were concentrated over Germany proper, defending the cities from the round-the-clock bombing campaign that was systematically destroying German industry. There were no significant air assets available to defend France, and even if there had been, they would have been overwhelmed by the sheer weight of Allied numbers. The phone rang again, startling him out of his dark thoughts. He grabbed it and identified himself, and this time the voice on the other end was his regimental commander, a major named Eismann, who Richter had always respected as a competent if unimaginative officer. Eismann sounded harried and stressed, speaking quickly and demanding to know exactly what Richter was seeing. Richter repeated his earlier report, adding more detail now that he had had time to study the fleet more carefully. He estimated at least several thousand vessels, possibly more, including multiple battleships and dozens of destroyers, with the main body of landing craft beginning to move toward the shore. Eismann swore, a rare lapse in professional demeanour that told Richter more about the situation than any amount of tactical discussion. The Major explained that reports were coming in from all along the coast, similar sightings of massive naval forces, and that the High Command was finally beginning to understand that this was not a diversion or a feint, but the real thing, the long-anticipated invasion. Orders were being issued to move reserves forward and to prepare for a major defensive battle, but Eismann's tone suggested he had little confidence that these measures would be sufficient. Then came the order that Richter had been waiting for. His battery was authorized to engage enemy shipping at will. He was to target landing craft and smaller vessels first, attempting to disrupt the landing operations and cause as many casualties as possible during the vulnerable approach phase. The battleships and larger warships were to be avoided unless they came within effective range, as engaging them would be a waste of ammunition that could be better used against softer targets. Richter acknowledged the order and hung up the phone, then turned to begin organizing his battery for action. The guns were already manned and ready, his sergeants having anticipated the order and prepared accordingly. The fire control teams were plotting solutions, using the mechanical calculators and range tables to convert visual observations into the precise angles and charges needed to drop shells onto targets many kilometers away. It was a complex process that required skill and training, but his men were good at their jobs, and within minutes they had solutions ready for several different target areas. He gave the order to load, and the gun crews sprang into action with practiced efficiency, hauling the heavy shells from the magazines and hoisting them into the breeches of the guns. Each shell weighed 50 kilograms and had to be handled carefully to avoid accidents. The propellant charges followed, canvas bags filled with explosive that would hurl the shells across the intervening distance. The breeches were closed with heavy metallic clangs that echoed through the concrete bunker, and the guns elevated to their calculated firing positions. Richter took a deep breath and allowed himself one last look at the approaching fleet through his binoculars. It had grown closer in the time it had taken to prepare for firing, and he could now make out more detail than before. He could see the distinctive shapes of the landing craft, flat-bottomed boats with bow ramps that would drop to allow soldiers to wade ashore. He could see larger LSTS carrying tanks and vehicles. He could see the white foam of their wakes as they churned through the water. And behind them, always behind them, were more and more ships, an endless reserve that seemed capable of replacing any losses instantly. For just a moment, he allowed himself to feel the full weight of what was happening. This was history. This was the moment when the war in the West changed forever. After this day, nothing would be the same. The Reich's Atlantic fortress was about to be breached, and there was nothing he or anyone else in the German army could do to prevent it. They could fight, they could inflict casualties, they could make the Allies pay for every metre of ground, but they could not win. The outcome was already determined by factors far beyond the control of individual soldiers standing in concrete bunkers. Then he pushed those thoughts aside and focused on his duty. He was a soldier, he had orders, and even if those orders were ultimately pointless, even if the battle was already lost before it began, he would do his job to the best of his ability. That was what soldiers did. He raised his hand, held it aloft for a moment to ensure everyone was ready, then brought it down sharply as he shouted the command to fire. The world erupted into noise and violence. The first gun fired with a concussion that shook the entire bunker, a massive boom that made his ears ring despite the protection of the thick concrete walls. A fraction of a second later, the second gun fired, then the third and fourth in rapid succession. Through the observation slit, he could see the muzzle flashes, brilliant orange-yellow flowers of flame that bloomed for an instant before being snatched away by the wind. He watched through his binoculars as the shells arced out over the water, invisible in flight, but betrayed by the faint smoke trails they left behind. The first salvo fell short, raising tall columns of water several hundred meters from the nearest landing craft. His fire control team immediately began calling corrections, adjusting for the fall of shot, and the guns were reloaded with frantic speed. The second salvo was closer, straddling a group of landing craft and causing them to take evasive maneuvers. The third salvo scored a hit, a direct strike on what looked like a smaller landing craft that exploded in a burst of smoke and debris. His men cheered, a brief moment of elation at having struck the enemy, and Richter felt a surge of professional pride. His battery was performing well, executing their drills under combat conditions and proving that their training had been effective. But even as he felt that pride, the rational part of his mind was already noting that they had destroyed one vessel out of thousands, that the gap in the formation was already closing, that the endless stream of landing craft simply absorbed the loss and continued forward without pause. The guns continued to fire, settling into a steady rhythm, shell after shell being hurled out toward the approaching invasion fleet. His ammunition reserves would not last long at this rate of fire, perhaps an hour of continuous shooting before they ran dry. But he put that concern aside and focused on making every shot count. They scored several more hits over the next few minutes, enough to make him think that maybe, just maybe, they could actually make a difference. And then the Allied fleet replied, and Richter discovered what it meant to be on the receiving end of naval gunfire. He saw the flashes first, brilliant points of light appearing on the hulls of the distant battleships and cruisers, silent at this distance but unmistakable in their meaning. He had perhaps 5 seconds to register what he was seeing before the first shells arrived, and in that brief window his mind had time to calculate distances and trajectories and realize with perfect clarity that his battery was about to experience something far worse than anything his guns could dish out. The shells did not make a whistling sound like in the movies. They made a sound like the sky being torn in half, a shrieking roar that grew louder and louder until it seemed to fill the entire universe. Then they impacted, and the world became fire and thunder and flying dirt. The ground heaved underneath him with enough force to knock him off his feet. Dust and debris rained down from the ceiling of the bunker. The lights flickered and went out, plunging them into darkness broken only by the dim emergency lighting. He scrambled back to his feet and rushed to the observation slit, driven by the need to see what was happening, even though every instinct screamed at him to take cover. What he saw made his blood run cold. The fields around his position had been transformed into a lunar landscape, cratered and torn by shells that were far larger than anything his battery could fire. One of his gun positions had taken a direct hit, the reinforced concrete casemate reduced to rubble, the gun itself twisted into an unrecognizable shape. He could see no survivors. The bombardment continued, a methodical and systematic destruction of the German positions along the coast. More shells fell, each impact creating massive explosions that sent earth and rock fountaining into the air. The sound was continuous now, a rolling thunder that never paused, and Richter realized with growing horror that this was just the beginning. The Allies were not trying to win a duel with his battery. They were trying to erase it, to pound his position into dust through sheer weight of high explosives. His remaining guns kept firing, the crews displaying remarkable courage by continuing to serve their weapons, even as the ground around them erupted with incoming shells. They were professionals doing their job, and Richter felt a fierce pride in them even as he knew they were doomed. Another gun was hit, this one knocked out of action but not completely destroyed, the crew scrambling clear just before a second shell finished the job. That left him with 2 functioning guns out of 4, and both of those were showing signs of mechanical strain from the rapid rate of fire. Through the chaos, he tried to maintain some kind of tactical picture, tried to understand what was happening beyond his immediate vicinity. He could hear scattered reports over the radio, other units calling in sightings and requesting orders and reporting casualties. The entire coastline was under bombardment, not just his sector, but everywhere the Allies had chosen to land. The volume of fire being directed at the German defences was beyond anything anyone had anticipated, beyond anything that military theory suggested was possible. The planners who had designed the Atlantic Wall had assumed that naval gunfire would be limited in its effectiveness, that the concrete fortifications could withstand anything the ships could throw at them. They had been catastrophically wrong. The sky was full of aircraft now, wave after wave of bombers adding their payloads to the naval bombardment, transforming the entire coastal region into an inferno of exploding ordnance. Richter watched fighters strafe the German positions with machine gun fire, their cannon shells tearing through anything that was not protected by thick concrete. He saw one of his own men, a young private who had been moving between positions carrying ammunition, cut down by a strafing run, his body jerking like a puppet with its strings cut before collapsing into a motionless heap. Where was the response? Where were the panzers that were supposed to counterattack and drive the invaders back into the sea? Where were the reserves that were supposed to reinforce the coastal defences? He knew the answer, of course. They were stuck in a command structure that was paralysed by disbelief and bad intelligence, scattered across France and unable to move quickly without exposing themselves to Allied air attack. The plan had been that the coastal forces would hold the beaches long enough for the mobile reserves to arrive and launch a decisive counter-offensive, but that plan had depended on assumptions that were proving to be fatally flawed. His remaining guns continued their duel with the invasion fleet, and Richter watched through his binoculars as they scored another hit, this time on what looked like an American destroyer that was moving close to shore to provide direct fire support for the landing forces. The shell struck somewhere near the waterline, and he saw a flash of fire and a gout of black smoke rising from the vessel. For a moment, he felt a savage satisfaction, thinking they had actually managed to sink one of the major warships. But then he saw the destroyer still moving, still firing, clearly damaged but far from destroyed. Later, he would learn that this was likely the USS Corrie, which had indeed been hit by coastal artillery, though it may have also struck a mine. The ship would sink, but not before accomplishing its mission. But that small victory was meaningless in the larger context. One destroyer damaged or destroyed made no difference when there were hundreds of other ships ready to take its place. The Allied fleet was like some kind of mythological hydra, impossible to kill because destroying one part of it accomplished nothing when the whole was so vast. His guns could fire until they melted down from the heat, could destroy 100 ships, and it would not matter because there would still be 1,000 more. The naval bombardment intensified, if such a thing was even possible, and Richter felt the bunker shake with impacts that came closer and closer to his position. He knew it was only a matter of time before they took a direct hit, and when that happened, the bunker's armour would mean nothing against shells designed to penetrate battleship plate. He considered ordering an evacuation, getting his men out of the bunker and into the field where they might have a better chance of survival. But he dismissed the thought almost immediately. The fields were being subjected to bombardment that was even more intense than what was hitting the fortified positions, and besides, he still had functioning guns and ammunition, and as long as that was true, he had a duty to keep fighting. The light was growing brighter now, the sun beginning to break through the overcast, and in the improved visibility, Richter could see the first wave of landing craft approaching the beach. The moment he had been dreading, the moment when this abstract naval battle became a concrete struggle for ground, was arriving. He could see the distinctive shapes of the American Higgins boats, their flat fronts designed to beach themselves and drop their bow ramps to discharge their cargo of soldiers. Behind them came larger craft carrying tanks and artillery, and he knew that once those vehicles got ashore, the defensive position would become completely untenable. The German machine gun positions along the beach opened fire, and Richter could hear the chatter of the MG-42s even over the ongoing bombardment, that distinctive sound that had earned them the nickname Hitler's buzzsaw among Allied troops. The guns were brutally effective, firing at such a high rate that the individual shots blended into a continuous roar, and he could see through his binoculars the terrible effect they were having on the soldiers trying to exit the landing craft. The water around the boats was churning white with impacts, and he could see bodies falling, men cut down before they even reached the beach. For a few minutes, it seemed like the defences might actually hold. The Americans were taking horrific casualties, pinned down in the surf and unable to advance against the weight of fire coming from the German positions. This was Omaha Beach, and it would earn its reputation as the bloodiest of the landing sites, the place where the invasion came closest to actually failing. Richter felt a grim hope stirring in his chest, the irrational thought that maybe, against all odds, they could actually stop this. But then the Allied destroyers did something that military doctrine said they should never do. They steamed directly toward the shore, closing to ranges that put them at risk of grounding, some of them pushing so close to the beach that we were in danger of running aground. And from those suicidal positions, they opened fire on the German fortifications at point-blank range, their 5-inch guns hammering the bunkers and pillboxes with shell after shell, providing the kind of close fire support that was turning the tide of the battle. Richter watched in horrified fascination as the naval gunfire systematically destroyed one German position after another. A bunker that had been pouring machine gun fire into the landing forces would suddenly explode as a naval shell found its firing slit. A mortar pit would disappear in a cloud of smoke and debris. The carefully prepared fields of fire were being disrupted by explosions that threw up curtains of dirt and rock, creating dead zones where the defenders could no longer see their targets. And while the destroyers were demolishing the fortifications, strange new machines were appearing on the beach. Richter had never seen anything like them, tanks that seemed to be equipped for specialized purposes rather than straight combat. Some had huge rotating drums mounted on the front, flailing chains against the ground to detonate mines. Others had massive bundles of logs or fascines that they could drop into anti-tank ditches to create crossings. Still others had flamethrowers or specialized demolition charges. These were the famous Hobart's Funnies, specialized armor that the British had developed specifically to overcome beach defenses, and they were proving devastatingly effective. One of his remaining guns was hit by a naval shell and put out of action, the blast shattering the gun's recoil mechanism and rendering it unable to fire. That left him with a single functioning artillery piece, still gamely firing away at the invasion fleet, still trying to make some kind of difference in a battle that was already decided. He wanted to order them to cease fire, to save their ammunition and their lives, but he could not bring himself to give that order. To stop fighting was to admit defeat, and he was not ready to do that yet, even though every rational part of his mind knew that defeat was inevitable. The Americans were getting off the beach now, small groups managing to find cover and advance inland, destroying the German positions one by one with grenades and satchel charges and sheer bloody-minded determination. Richter could see combat engineers blowing gaps in the wire obstacles, infantry squads providing covering fire while others advanced. The slow but inexorable process of reducing a fortified position through combined arms tactics. It was textbook stuff, the kind of thing that would be studied in military academies for decades to come, except that the textbooks would not capture the human cost, the bodies floating in the surf and the wounded men crying out for medics. His last gun fired its final shell, then went silent as the ammunition reserves were exhausted. The crew looked to him for orders, their faces blackened with powder smoke and pale with exhaustion and fear. Richter felt the weight of command press down on him, the responsibility for these men's lives suddenly very immediate and very heavy. He could order them to stay and fight with small arms, trading their lives for maybe a few more minutes of resistance, or he could order a withdrawal, trying to get them inland to link up with whatever reserves might be forming to contest the Allied advance. Before he could make that decision, the decision was made for him. A naval shell, probably from one of the cruisers that had been systematically working over the German positions, scored a direct hit on the bunker. The world turned white and then black, sound and sight and sensation all ceasing for a timeless moment. When awareness returned, Richter found himself on the floor of the bunker, his ears ringing so badly that he could not hear anything, blood running from his nose and from a cut on his forehead. Around him, the bunker was a scene of devastation, the observation slit blown open, equipment smashed and scattered, several of his men down and not moving. He staggered to his feet, fighting against the disorientation and the urge to simply lie down and let it all end. The bunker was no longer a defensive position. It was a tomb, and staying here meant dying here. He grabbed the nearest man, shouting orders that he could not hear his own voice giving, and began organizing an evacuation. The survivors gathered what they could, grabbed their weapons and a small amount of ammunition, and stumbled out of the bunker into the devastated landscape beyond. The scene that greeted them was something from the end of the world. As far as Richter could see, the land was cratered and burning, smoke rising from 100 fires, the carefully maintained fields and hedgerows transformed into a wasteland. Allied aircraft were everywhere overhead, a moving ceiling of metal that dominated the sky in a way that made it clear no German counter-air response was coming. And on the beach, thousands of Allied soldiers were pouring ashore, backed by tanks and artillery and all the material might of an industrial superpower that had decided to exert its full strength. Richter rallied his surviving men, perhaps 30 of them from the original 60, and began moving inland, away from the beach and the apocalyptic violence of the landing zone. They moved through a landscape that was being systematically destroyed, encountering scattered groups of other German soldiers, some still trying to fight, others simply trying to survive. No one had orders. No one knew what they were supposed to be doing. The command structure had collapsed under the weight of the Allied assault, and they were reduced to small groups of men making their own decisions about what to do. They passed burned-out vehicles and destroyed equipment, the debris of a military force that had been overwhelmed by a power it could not match. They saw the bodies of German soldiers, some killed by the bombardment, others by Allied infantry who had already advanced this far inland. And always, there was the sound of the battle behind them, the endless roar of explosions and gunfire that marked the ongoing struggle for the beaches. At some point during that long, terrible day, Richter stopped thinking about the battle in tactical terms and began thinking about it in existential ones. This was not a defeat that could be reversed by a clever counterattack or a lucky strike. This was a fundamental shift in the balance of power, a demonstration that Germany had already lost the war, even if it would take another year of fighting to make that loss official. The industrial might that had put 7,000 ships in the English Channel was the same might that would soon have armies sweeping across France, that would bomb German cities to rubble, that would eventually grind the Wehrmacht into dust through sheer weight of material. He thought about the propaganda he had grown up with, the promises of Lebensraum and racial destiny, and the 1,000-year Reich. It had all been lies, delusions crafted by madmen and believed by a nation desperate for meaning after the humiliation of the previous war. The reality was so much simpler and more brutal. Germany had started a war it could not win, against enemies it could not defeat, and now the bill was coming due. The men dying on the beaches and in the fields were paying that bill with their blood, sacrifices to the hubris of leaders who had convinced themselves that willpower could overcome material reality. As the sun began to set on that longest day, Richter and his men found temporary shelter in a barn that had somehow survived the bombardment. They were exhausted, hungry, their ammunition depleted, their units scattered and destroyed as a fighting force. Around them, the battle continued to rage, the sound of it never ceasing, a constant reminder that this was not over, that there would be more days like this, that the war would grind on until Germany had nothing left to give. Richter sat with his back against the wall of the barn and allowed himself, finally, to feel the full weight of what had happened. The Atlantic Wall had fallen in a single day. The invasion that was supposed to be impossible had succeeded. The war that was supposed to end in German victory was going to end in German defeat. He had known it intellectually for months, perhaps years, but now he knew it in his bones, in his soul, with a certainty that could not be denied or rationalized away. The men around him were talking in quiet voices, sharing cigarettes and what little food they had managed to scavenge, trying to process the trauma of what they had experienced. Richter listened to them without really hearing the words, his mind still replaying images from the day, the sight of that impossible fleet materializing out of the mist, the sound of the naval bombardment, the feeling of watching history pivot on a single morning. He knew that these images would stay with him for the rest of his life, however long or short that might be. Tomorrow they would have to decide what to do, whether to try to find their unit or to join up with another defensive position or simply to surrender and hope that the Allies treated prisoners decently. But those were problems for tomorrow. Tonight he just sat in the growing darkness and thought about the morning when he had looked through his binoculars and seen the future arriving in the form of 7,000 ships, and he had known, with absolute certainty, that the Reich he had served was about to drown in a tide of steel that it had no hope of turning back.